we've done a survey. So we didn't try and do an all singing, all dancing survey, but we asked somebody from each of the 11 combined authority areas across the north to fill in that survey. Hopefully they've been the best person or one of the best people possible to fill that in, just to give us a sense of where we're up to in terms of relationships. And obviously we've got three new combined authorities coming on in the northwest, and we've got Greater Manchester and Liverpool City region that have been going for the best part of 10 years. So there's a broad mix in terms of relationships and maturity and timescales across all of them across the north of England. So Laura Tilston, who's our research and policy manager, will be just giving a broad brush summary of those surveys. Then we'll hear from Martin Brooks, who's the equivalent of me in the Northeast, who sits on the Northeast Combined Authority. And then we'll hear from Liz Windsor-Welsh, who I think is turning up at past, who's going to run through the Greater Manchester situation. And then we'll do a Q&A session and then some breakout workshops. And then we'll do final session on feedback and next steps from feedback from the workshops and what would be useful for people in terms of next steps. I think that's it from me. Please do introduce yourselves, as I said, in the chat and start talking. And I'll hand over to, got one more slide. So we have had some conversations with, I think it's John, I think his name is Jonathan Moore, who works at the Great North. So the Great North is the new body that's taken over from what was the Northern Powerhouse. So the Northern Powerhouse was a bit of a everybody included partnership arrangement. And the Great North is very much more dominated by the 11 metro mayors or mayoral leads. I know we're at different statuses in terms of having a metro mayor, but that's the new body that's kind of trying to provide support to the 11 combined authority strategic authorities. It's hosted at the Northeast Combined Authority, but we've had some positive conversations and they're interested in our suggestions from today and from the surveys and whatever else you think in terms of how we drive a race to the top in our working relationships with combined authorities. We thought it'd be useful to kind of just provide this space. We're not trying to be the secretariat or take over, so we're very interested in what would be useful and how we create a joint collaborative approach where people get what they need and what they want in order to drive the conversations locally. Right, so if I stop talking and I'll hand over to my colleague, Laura Tilston, who's our research and policy manager and part of our policy and information team to give you the survey findings. I hope you enjoyed today and find it useful.
Thanks, Warren. Hi, everyone. As Warren said, I'm Laura Tilston. I'm the Programme Manager for Research and Policy at Voluntary Sector Northwest. And I'm just going to go through some high-level findings from the survey that we administered just before Christmas across the North to get a northern picture of what current combined authority and VCFSE working looks like across the North, and what sort of our aspirations are and what the opportunities are for best practice and further developing those relationships, learning from each of the areas. So these were sort of the broad brush themes that we surveyed on, which I'll talk through. So we looked at voluntary sector representation and engagement, what this looks like across the North in different subregions, and what strategic frameworks exist to sort of act as sort of vehicles and drivers for some of this collaborative working, and what intelligence and data capacity currently exists in each subregion, what voluntary sector delivery looks like, and what sort of the combined authorities commissioning the voluntary sector to do, or what they're not commissioning us to do, and then sort of what the opportunities and challenges are moving forward. And so, as Warren said, we surveyed each subregion, sort of had one person from each subregion filling each survey in. So that what I'll go through is sort of the overall picture, which is quite mixed, really, as you'd imagine, with different regions being in different places in terms of their devolution journey. So I've split there's a lot of information on each slide, but they will go out after the event as well to look at in more detail, but I've sort of split it into what the current reality is on the ground and what best practice could look like or what it does look like. So in terms of representation and engagement, there's sort of an inconsistent picture across the north at the moment, across combined authority structures. We've got some areas that got formal seats on combined authority boards, but we've got others relying on sort of informal engagement mechanisms, or particularly where devolution is sort of emerging and places are still, or in the early stages of their journey, they're still negotiating this representation. There's a lot of thematic representation in place across the north. So particular work streams, maybe that's sort of children and young people, or mental health, or transport. This sector has some representation in those work streams, but in terms of that formal arrangement, it's pretty mixed at the moment. However, despite there being some lack of formal mechanisms in place, each area where this doesn't already exist has a plan in motion to try and develop this, which is really good. So for best practice in this area, we really want formal board representation with clear democratic processes for selecting sector reps, including having a seat on the combined authority board, having formal VCFSE leadership group recognised as a key contact point for combined authority engagement, and having representation on these working groups and work streams. So sector organisation and link roles. Have I skipped a slide? Let's check. No. So across the north, the sector has really strong networks and leadership groups already in existence and well established that work to unify the sector's voice and do some really great policy and events work to try and influence decision making in places, but also at some regional levels as well. So that already exists, and that's great. Leadership structures where they exist are still emerging in terms of having their influence, and link roles between sort of VCFSE leadership and combined authority structures are uncommon, but where they do exist, they're highly effective. So that's something that we really want each place to be able to get to have that sort of liaison role. So in terms of best practice, what we want to see is having established leadership groups and partnerships that act as a single point of contact for the sector, formal link roles that are responsible for VCFSE combined authority relationships and strategic alignment. So this could be a secondment role or liaison role that really works to champion the voluntary sector from within the combined authority. You have someone present in the offices, you have a go-to person to have conversations with and represent the sector on different work streams, and also normalising working with the sector as well. So that's a key piece that we'd like to achieve. For work stream inclusion, in terms of different work streams across combined authority working, there is some comprehensive involvement in some areas with sector representatives embedded in different work streams. Some areas report having some stalled engagement or having some struggle to influence. This could be, due to a myriad of factors, but some factors are referenced in the survey include having resource constraints, so the sector not necessarily being funded to be on different boards and groups and not having an impact on capacity to really engage and influence. Reports of sort of engagement with the sector feeling like a tick box exercise, and maybe also there being a lack of understanding of how the sector works and also how to work with it as well. In terms of equalities, the approaches across different areas are very varied and fragmented. We do have some really good models of equalities working in development across the north, but there are some references to how Changing political dynamics across the North are complicating progress on equalities as well. So perhaps some places that are perhaps don't see equalities as a pressing issue or a priority area, and this is really impacting on the sector's ability to make progress in these areas. But for best practice, we want to see consistent representation across major policy areas and funding discussions, and really build that capacity in for the sector to be representatives in these areas. Having equalities panels and networks that embed lived experience and diverse voices in decision making, and making sure that sort of equalities panels in communities and in the sector really align with any equalities panels that exist in strategic authorities or combined authorities, so that link is there. And having research and intelligent partnerships act as vehicles for influencing on behalf of the sector and ensuring that the sector is understood. In terms of working towards shared priorities and joint statements and joint working, each area has some form of voluntary sector manifesto or strategy which outlines the sector's ambitions in each place or each sub-region. In terms of the combined authorities' own strategies, this varies. So some combined authorities have explicit mention of the voluntary sector as a partner and including the voluntary sector as a partner in different priority areas, whereas some places sort of have indirect references without sort of any real commitment. So again, sort of mixed across the board. Having joint statements with combined authorities are uncommon, but when this occurs, it really reflects some mature partnership working, and each area in the survey aspired to achieve this. So in terms of best practice, we want to see comprehensive manifestos and state of the sector reports developed with broad sector input, and have these endorsed by the combined authority or the mayor as well. So sort of a rubber stamp on sort of having that commitment from this combined authority to work with the sector to achieve our shared priorities. Collaborative letters and policy pieces issued jointly by the sector and the combined authority were seen as aspirational. Strategies that embed the voluntary sector as key partner in delivering decision making, and maybe developing some metrics so we can measure and understand what success looks like in terms of combined authority and voluntary sector partnership working as well. For formal working arrangements, these are rare, but they do represent best practice. So this could look like an accord, a compact, a covenant, or some sort of fair funding protocols or frameworks. Most areas do lack these formal agreements or commissioning frameworks, but there are plans to put this in place in most areas, which is really good. Dedicated investment in the sector is currently uncommon, but with sort of formal working arrangements, sometimes this follows as well. So that is something that we really want to achieve for each place. So yeah, best practice, written agreements that set out principles for collaboration and accountability, having formal commissioning principles that prioritise equity, transparency and local delivery, and multi-year sustained funding commitments to build sector capacity. We did ask people to identify what sort of areas the voluntary sector is commissioned or funded to deliver by their combined authority, and this isn't true of all areas. It might be skewed, but these are the sorts of things that the sector has been commissioned to deliver across the North. So skills and employment, transport, housing, business support, regeneration, community safety, sports, and sort of joint proposals. So what's working well then? What's positive, and what are the current challenges? So as Warren pointed out, there's different stages of relationships at the moment. We've got established combined authorities and ones that are emerging, but overall, it feels like there are really strong relationships are being built upon and being developed, that are harnessing trust, promoting proactive leadership engagement and structured collaboration. Where places are on the early stages of their journey for devolution, the engagement shows promise at the moment, which is great. Most areas have a manifesto or advocacy groups in development, and we're not sort of starting from scratch. We are building on existing foundations. So we have relationships that we're building upon and ways of working that we know work. And so, yeah, we're not starting from scratch. We're building something on what already exists. In terms of challenges, I don't think these are specific to devolution. I think these are quite common across the sector as a whole, but having that lack of formal recognition and formal structures has been a hindrance. Inconsistent communications between the combined authority and the voluntary sector and communities, resource constraints and delays in funding, undermining of trust and reluctance to transfer power, linked to sort of decisions being made without sector input in some cases, and sort of the changing political dynamics across the north, being a bit of a challenge that we need to see how we can overcome. And ultimately, our best practice would be to achieve embedding of representation, formal agreements and financial investment, combined with open communication, transparent decision making and clear contact points to reduce fragmentation. I think this is my final slide. So some of the key takeaways here. Every combined authority is different, and every combined authority is evolving and growing, whether they've been around for 10 years or they're just starting. You know, we're all going on the journey. I think there will always be opportunities to influence. So I don't think we need to panic. We just need to build on sort of the good practice that's already happening. Understanding the ambitions of your combined authority, understanding where the shared priorities are and the levers are for influencing. You know, it might not be the mayor that has the most influence. We might need to work with policy leads or project officers. So understanding where our touch points are. Devolution is fundamental to the combined authority's identity. So encouraging thinking around double devolution, you know, how the sector can lead on many things and perhaps do this more effectively. Agree some principles, so we know that having formal working arrangements is a key driver and enabler to achieving what we want to achieve. So prioritising this and perhaps using the civil society covenant as an enabler to do so. And then once we have principles in place, pushing for partnership in governance, design and delivery across a broad range of things. So there's just some here like prevention, population health, brokering integrated working, the VCFSE estate, inclusive economy, tackling poverty and the broader determinants of health. And I think ultimately, you know, we live and work in these areas. So whether it's our job or just as our role within communities, you know, we have an opportunity, we have an ability to influence and grow our combined authority to really truly serve our communities. So I think that's me, Warren.
Thank you, Laura. I think it's quite a mixed picture, isn't it?
Yeah.
Thank you for running through that. The history and the relationships with the sector is very different from combined authority area to combined authority area. I think there's often a significant gap between what good could look like and the reality. I think that the bottom line at this point is combined authorities and us are inventing the wheel, one place, one combined authority area at a time at the moment. There's no kind of understanding of what good could look like or even what bad looks like in terms of our relationship with the VCFSE sector. So thank you very much for pulling that together, and everyone who contributed to that survey, thank you very much as well. We thought it'd be useful to move on to some specific case studies. We've picked out a couple of areas which we think are doing better than others. So it wasn't in any sense to say, and some of these have been around much longer than other areas. So we just wanted to say and run through some of the realities. So the first speaker we've got, and thank you, is to Martin Brooks, who's the Chief Exec of VON, who's part of the North East Combined Authority. There's two combined authorities in the North East. There's the North East one and then the Teesside one. I'll hand over to you now, Martin.
Okay, thanks, Warren. So what I'm going to do is I want to talk most particularly about our experience in the North East with the North East Combined Authority, rather than with the Tees Valley Combined Authority. I know there are some kind of colleagues from the Tees Valley here on this call, and I think both they can speak to some of that as well, if not better than me. And also, bluntly, we have less traction in the Tees Valley, and I think that's a combination of both the way that the Tees Valley Combined Authority operates, and also, if I'm truthful, I think about the way that VON has historically operated. We are certainly going to address the latter. We have no control over the former, but we can kind of persevere somewhat. So I'm going to focus mostly on how we work with NECA, or they don't like to call it NECA. They call it, but that's how generally in kind of common parlance up in the North East is NECA. So the next slide, have I got control of slides, Laura, or not? Do I need to ask you? I need to ask you to jump slide. Can you go to the next slide, please?
I'll change them. Don't worry.
Okay, thanks. So you would be totally understandable if you didn't know much about either VON or the structure of the North East. So this slide gives you a little bit about that. VON is we've got 1,500 members. I think we're the largest regional membership body of the VCFSE sector in certainly in England. We have very well established, over 20 years in operation now, and I'm relatively new in post. I've sort of come from London, and I'm going to draw on my London experience as well in what I sort of say. And I was struck when I first took over on how well established and how well recognised it is in the region. And quite to the extent that one of the first things I had to do when I became chief executive was to sort of to join the cabinet of the North East Combined Authority as what they call the CVS rep for the cabinet. So we have kind of like a good status and stand-in officially within the NECA region. Prior to running VON, I was running a thing called London Plus, which is a much smaller than VON, interestingly, kind of infrastructure body in London. And some of my experiences or some of my reflections on this, I draw on my experiences working with the GLA in London. And so I'm going to kind of highlight a few kind of bullet points later on about what I think are the kind of basic principles of how to do this, or do this as well as you can. And they are informed by both working with NECA and also working with the GLA as well. I'm not going to, as you can sort of see from this slide, the NECA region covers 7 local authorities, and the Tees Valley Combined Authority region, TVCA, covers 5. So we have 12 local authorities in our region, which is fairly large. It also covers kind of some of the most deprived communities in England. The way NECA is constructed, and this is both, I think, because of big P politics and also the inherent nature of the region, is there's a big emphasis on the VCFSE sector, a big emphasis on the foundational economy, on the inclusive economy. And so it's in theory kind of fertile ground for, I'll answer your question in a moment, Joe, more fully. It's quite a fertile ground for the sector to have influence and to succeed. In some senses, that's more so than in London, where I was before, where it's a kind of more complicated picture and you're covering like 32 different local authorities, some kind of quite complicated regional kind of politics. So, Joe, your question, yes, there is a place on the cabinet for, they call it the CVS, Community Voluntary Sector. So there's a CVS rep who is the chief executive of VON, who sits as a non-voting capacity on the cabinet. Now, let me explain what that means, I think, in practice. Can you jump forward a slide, please, Laura? basically the cabinet, the way Necker cabinet works, and you can watch, it's live streamed on YouTube if you are really minded to watch it. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but if you're minded to watch it, it's there. And because of that, it's basically very performative. It's very kind of like tightly kind of curated and sort of controlled as in each of the kind of council leaders. So there's the 7 council leaders plus the head of the Chamber of Commerce and also myself as the CVS kind of rep, and that's the cabinet plus the mayor, the Labour mayor Kim McGuinness. That is the kind of the structure of the kind of cabinet. And basically it's choreographed in the sense that some council leaders will want to say something, particularly if something's about their patch or they want to make a political point. And then increasingly, we're sort of edging towards it being more big P political points being made at cabinet. But not much actually happens at cabinet. The real action happens much earlier on. And the challenge for being the kind of VCSE rep is how do you exercise influence? And what being on the cabinet means is it means you have access. You don't have kind of like direct power, but it means you have access to ask questions and try to exercise influence. They sort of have to listen to you, the officials do. Now, the Necker officials and the mayor are very minded to listen, and they're very open to listening and to being persuaded, but you do not have kind of formal powers. And so you have to kind of work out where things are being decided within Necker. Then the problem with Necker is it is an organization which is still evolving, and it's hard to work out where power always sits and how decisions on it always being made. Now, in my experience, you could say that's because Necker is still evolving. It evolved partly out of the North of Tyne Combined Authority, which was just the 3 local authority areas north of the Tyne, and then Necker is an expanded version of that, bringing in 4 local authority areas south of the Tyne, for those who don't know the geography up here. But I don't, certainly my experience based in London, working with the GLA, the fact that a combined authority is younger and still evolving does not mean it's going to be clear at the end point how decisions are made. And I think one of the key lessons I've worked in London is that you need multiple points of entry. If you want to influence how things are done, it's not enough to have a particular position or a particular recognition or a particular contact or entry point. You need multiple entry points across the organization. So you got to work quite hard to build relationships, plural, and kind of good relationships and connections to exercise influence. And that takes resources. Now, what this slide does is it explains some of how we think and we believe, and we can somewhat evidence how we are exercising influence. So, for example, we have got influence over all the advisory boards that the Necker has set up, which are linked kind of like to mirror the missions of Necker. It has a series of missions, and sort of who doesn't these days. And that guides what it does. But those advisory boards, bluntly, don't operate as advisory boards. They are almost broadcast channels for Necker to tell the sector, not just my sector, but all sectors, what's going on. So actually, at a recent meeting of one of the advisory boards, someone from the business sector actually asked a question of the chair, who's a council leader, and of the Necker officials who were there. Said, "Are you actually asking our opinions on this, or even asking permission, or are you just telling us what you're doing?" And there's this uncomfortable kind of shuffling on chairs, and the answer is basically they're telling you what's going on. So the advisory boards are actually at the moment misnamed. Now, I think that you can give somewhat the benefit of the doubt there, but I also think that they haven't really thought through properly how they engage with external stakeholders well. And I think one of the challenges for the sector, one of the things that we have to kind of work out, actually, how are we going to spot the mechanisms that really matter where we can influence things? We've got a combined authority which is minded to be positive, minded to be supportive, where the foundational economy, child poverty, inclusive economy are really kind of writ large in the way that the mayor talks and thinks, and that the way the kind of corporate plan is written. But that doesn't necessarily mean you can work out how you can influence things within that. It's quite a sort of art, and it's an art that I don't think we've fully mastered yet. I think we are trying to learn and trying to master. So it takes a lot of energy and a lot of resources, and I don't think we always get it right. And I also think, also, as I'll come on to in a moment, I think sometimes we are a bit too generous to them in how we kind of judge them. We give them the benefit of the doubt too much. Oh, they're still evolving, they're still settling down. And sometimes you start thinking, yeah, you are, but hang on. But I think the same with the GLA from the past, which is a very well established kind of regional government body. It is actually very generous towards the sector in London, but it doesn't always. It sometimes thinks very clumsily or lazily about it, and it should be held to account probably perhaps more firmly than it sometimes is. But these are the ways that we are trying to do that. I'm not going to read out slides because you can do that as well as I can, and probably better than I can. But there are multiple mechanisms where we're trying to improve that the way that NECA thinks about the sector and the way that we engage with it. But it is an ongoing task to do that well. And almost daily, there are in my inbox appear stuff from NECA asks us to do something. Something's gone wrong. I mean, some of the colleagues here on the Tees Valley, from the Tees Valley, were on a call earlier with me today with our wider colleagues across the whole of the Northeast region, where there's lots of genuine and legitimate gnashing of teeth about the relationship with NECA, about that, yeah, they're not doing what that they sort of say they might do and that we would like them to do. And I think what we need to do as VON, as a sort of the sort of sector interface with them, is do a better job than we currently do, and that's partly about resourcing. Can we jump ahead slide, please?
Leave that running. I've got my camera off. Just come back. I just need to read the slides.
Hey, if you're not speaking, could you mute? Sorry. Thank you.
So let me say that NECA does not currently fund VON structurally to engage with it. So our engagement is unfunded except when there are particular projects that they pay us for. That's something that we are going to address, and hopefully they're going to kind of like fix. They recognise that they need us, they recognise that they want us, and we need to create a funded sort of stand-in facility. Laura talked a bit about capacity earlier on. I am basically the point person for NECA, but I'm also the chief executive of VON and do various other things as well. We need someone who wakes up in the morning who thinks about nothing other than our relationship, the sector's relationship with NECA and how we engage with them. That said, I think that there are certain things that we have learnt and that I've learnt about how to engage effectively with NECA, albeit we're not engaging as effectively yet as we might do and want to do. The first is to try to understand that structure. So I sort of said, build good relationships across the organisation, not just one point. I go right back to my time in with the GLA, which was the beginning of 2020 when I joined London Plus, which is a sort of like half-formed organisation. Then it was an idea, but hadn't really kind of like gelled or something. And I went to see the GLA, and I was in London all my life, but I've not worked on London as an issue, as a topic before. And I went to the GLA. I said, "Can you give me an organogram so I can actually understand, like how it works?" And they looked at me like, what are you talking about? We don't have one of those. Why would we have one of those? Because we don't necessarily really understand ourselves. And you assume by saying that we feel that we should help you understand. And so I never actually got to the point where I could actually write down an organogram of the structure of the GLA. Similarly with NECA, I think I understand it. And they may have produced organograms, they may have produced kind of like pictures to show, but they haven't really kind of shared and talked those through with us in a way that helps us do our job. So I try to build relationships across the whole organization and understand it. And that's at multiple levels as well. Right. So being on the cabinet of NECA, I could probably throw my toys out the pram and get to the chief executive of NECA or even to the mayor, Kim McGuinness, and say, "Oi, this isn't working." And that might work, but you can only do that a certain number of times. So it's better to have multiple contacts and multiple points of entry to try to fix things at kind of like lower levels rather than kind of like play the kind of the sort of heavy hand, because it won't work all the time and it may actually be a kind of clunky way of doing things. The second one, and this is where I do sometimes wonder if I can be a little bit naive, is work on the basis that their interests align with yours. And that they are partners, not adversaries. And I think you can see that within, and you can't necessarily see that within all combined authorities. I'm not entirely sure at times whether TVCA, the Tees Valley Combined Authority, is like that, because they're big P politics and maybe also small P kind of regional kind of politics and behaviours mean those interests don't necessarily kind of like coincide. But I think in the Neckar region, you can sort of see that what they want kind of like overlaps a lot with what the sector wants. The Mayor Kim McGuinness has successfully got child poverty into the local growth plan in a good way. The foundational economy also is in the local growth plan. We have got we with a lot of people managed to get Neckar to include the VCSE sector more firmly in their local growth plan than they were minded to otherwise. That is a success, but it doesn't produce anything real yet. It's a kind of like the door's open, we're going to work out how we kind of push through it. But we assume that they are working with a similar set of interests and concerns to us. Now, big P politics might change that over time, but even there, where we're sort of seeing, let's mention reform, where we're seeing that locally, we don't necessarily assume their interests are different, wholly different from the sectors. So treat them as partners, not adversaries. I've got more vignettes I can tell you about that, particularly from London, but I'll spare those for now. And the third point is give them solutions. I remember being told by the chief advisor to Sadiq Khan down in London, the mayor of London, after a call in the middle of COVID, when someone had said something about the role of the sector. And he said to me privately, and he's left now, so I'll say it, I don't care, and I'll break in confidence. He said, I'm so sick of the sector's sense of entitlement. Every time I sort of hear about the kind of good of the sector, he said, I just need solutions. I need stuff we can do, not just to be told how great they are. So work out what practical ways that you can help them achieve what they're trying to do, not just assert the value of the sector, because it doesn't always work, it doesn't achieve anything. And the final point, practically, I'll come on to, and I'll give it a case study in a moment, is don't be political. We ran our conference last year, our annual conference on the shifting kind of political climate and what the sector can do in it. And we got a guy from Staffordshire to come across, Gary, who runs a CVS in Staffordshire, who did a brilliant talk, and also one of our colleagues in Durham, who did a great talk about how you can practically engage with politicians from reform and politicians of all colours. And I think there's a boundary perhaps where pragmatism gets superseded by values. And I think that may be something what we end up with. We'll sort of see how it goes. The way the Northeast is shaping up at the moment, the Neckar region that is, and the Northeast is shaping up, we could end up with 4 reform-led councils after May. There's already Durham. So if you think of that 7 within the Neckar region, you could have 4 out of the 7 local authorities being controlled by reform with a Labour mayor. And it could be kind of interesting kind of politics, and it could be like regionally and also interesting politics locally, and seeing how the kind of the sector is. We have not got an accord yet, by the way, thinking of something about Laura said about the covenant, or someone's put in the chat. I'm bluntly very skeptical about the way the covenant's going to work out locally. I mean, I don't know if it's a sort of like old age and cynicism, but I don't really kind of see how it's going to kind of work. I lived through the year of the Compact. I was involved with the design of what became Compact Plus, which is a complete flop. So I let someone on this call, I won't say who, I was at the launch of the Civil Society Covenant in London, and I sort of said, what would it mean for you in X? I won't say X, because it'll reveal who they are. And he said, I've got no idea. I don't know. It may mean nothing at all. I've got no real hard evidence to think it will do. So we'll have to sort of see on that. I don't think it's going to be a great stick with which to beat Neckar. But I think we need to establish our own accord or covenant locally for that. So those, I think, are the kind of rules. Quickly jump forward, Laura, and I'm mindful of time, and I'm not sure if I'm overrun or not. I can see Warren on camera. Have I got a thumbs up or thumbs down for a minute? A little bit. Okay. A key area where we're working with them is on the Trailblazer Fund around economic connectivity. And this is about trying to get the sector to have better systems of engagement with Neckar around the way it works on economic inactivity. And I think it's a good thing that NECA are doing this. It's a good thing they're thinking not just about funding activities, but thinking about how they fund system change. So whenever there's an opportunity to engage with the combined authority about how to do things better, not just to do more things, but how to do things differently and better, we want to kind of seize on that. And again, we might be being naive, and strikingly on this is, we've yet to be paid any money for this, even though one of the issues that's going to come out of this is the need for prompt payment on work, I'm sure. So there's an irony in some of this, and my ongoing kind of positivity is sometimes kind of questioned as to be whether it's naive. But where there is an opportunity to try to influence system change, give them the benefit of the doubt and work with them positively to come up with practical solutions. I'm going to stop there, Warren. I think, and see if there are kind of questions. I'll look through the chat as well, to see whether or not anything is that I need to address in there. But hopefully, it gives a kind of like a snapshot of how things are working here.
Thank you very much, Martin. We've got Liz Windsor-Welsh who's going to do Greater Manchester next, and then we've got a Q&A session. So if people want to ask questions in chat, please do. But we will do a bit where you can stick your hand up and actually speak as well when we get to after the next one. I'll hand over to Liz Windsor-Welsh, who's the Chief Exec of Action Together, which is one of the councils for voluntary service in Greater Manchester. And Liz has been very much a leader in terms of the relationship and the work that we do in Greater Manchester. Couldn't do without her. So shall I hand over to you now, Liz?
Happy to. Nice to be here. Thanks for the welcome. There are a few people from Greater Manchester, I think, on the call. I've spotted at least 2 or 3. So do chip in, disagree with me. It's absolutely fine on the chat if you like. And particular shout out to Anne Lithgow, who I haven't seen for a bit. So hi. I'll do a whistle stop with just a few slides, and then it would be great to get into the conversation. I suppose the backdrop in Greater Manchester is that if you could just put the slides on a little bit further, Laura. Yeah, we've been working at this for over 10 years. So if you look at the first kind of formation of the way that our sector has organised in order to influence and work together to connect with the city region and its devolved powers, it goes all the way back to 2015. So we've changed different names. We've had various different forms of physical kind of accords or memorandum of understandings to underpin the relationships. But essentially, we have been working together with the Combined Authority and NHSGM and with the different parts of the leadership within our sector for over 10 years. And I think that's got us to a strong place today, in which then it's helped us to cement these things. So I suppose one of my early messages, this hasn't been quick. And the other thing is that we are fortunate that our city region and the Combined Authority is a coterminous footprint, and that we have shared governance and decision making over kind of government, local authority, kind of combined authority spend, so the devolution deals, and also the NHS reforms. So we have, that is a really fortunate position. I know that isn't the same position for everybody that'll be on the call as well. Can you flick us on again? So when I say us, so there is a coalition of the willing across Greater Manchester's voluntary community faith and social enterprise sector. These are some of the pictures of some of the leaders that would describe themselves as part of the Greater Manchester leadership group. Many people have been involved since its evolution, and it's supported by Voluntary Sector Northwest. So Warren is the chair, and there's a team of people, Anna and others that are on the call, Cassie, that facilitate and support the working of this group of leaders to try and affect change. They've come together. There was, in its early days, there was kind of, really good sense making of, what is our common purpose, what are we striving for, what is it that we want, and we're all passionate about ending inequality across Greater Manchester. So that's absolutely the thread that connects us, But many of the individuals within this leadership group are looking at things from different perspectives, whether it be thematically or kind of in terms of people's age, so young and old, through to kind of different communities of identity and experience. And we broadly split across this group between a third being about infrastructure, so they're enablers and support organisations and mechanisms. There's then those that strive and help connect people around tackling inequality specifically and as specialists, and then there's others that would describe themselves as various different providers. So this is a leadership group and multiple people playing their part, I suppose, to affect change. If we could move on again with the slide. We've been, as I said, we've been here for a while, so the partnerships and the ways of working within Greater Manchester are also quite well established. So there are numerous different mechanisms for partnership and decision making, and I think bar the actual combined authority internal governance meetings, I think our sector is on all of the most senior and executive boards. Some of them are paid positions, some of them have a little bursary and support to them. Others are, people do them as part of their connection to the broader leadership group. So as I mentioned before, there is then the convening of those leaders across the different spatial and thematic areas of our work. And we do have some paid employment. So the combined authority itself employs somebody who is a strategic lead to the voluntary sector. So that's really useful as a point person within the combined authority, but also we have a few paid roles that sit across the leadership group. Few of them full-time and dedicated, but some of them, a significant resource in order to free up capacity to ensure that there is some strategic influencing from our sector in relation to particular areas of our focus, and some of those are listed there. Economy of skills, I think that has been mentioned earlier, but also in Greater Manchester there's a big strategic ambition around Live Well, and that really is about whole scale prevention and that the left shift towards supporting people at the earliest point, and so that's something our sector's really heavily involved in as well. The mechanisms of the accord, I'm agreeing with Martin that in itself it doesn't do anything, the piece of paper, but actually the work that goes on behind the scenes to describe what the accord does and why it's important, and for it to be a mechanism to be used within the combined authority structures. So if you think about the different directorates within the combined authority and all the different policy leads, it's a mechanism particularly for the internal sort of staff and those influencing from outside to really kind of explain why certain things are really important. So it's a shorthand to some commitments that we've made, and so there are informal ways that we work together on the accord, and then there's formal commitment meetings with some of the senior execs, and that is about us reviewing progress. It should be about reviewing progress from both what have we said that the sector's going to do and what have we said that the combined authority and or NHSGM is going to do. It hasn't always worked that way. It has felt a little bit like a reporting space, but there's commitments to change that, I think, as we move forward. There's all sorts of different working groups and committees that help support the representation and the reps themselves. So I suppose that's not to be underestimated in a sense, the machinery and the sheer amount of time and commitment that happens to kind of get people into the right spaces and also to support them when they're in those spaces to be as effective as they can. Can we click on a bit? Some of those networks and partnerships. So, I mean, part of my job is also a director of 10GM, and that's a coalition and a collection of the local infrastructure organisations across Greater Manchester. And I suppose that's evidence of the strength of connections and again the maturity of the voluntary sector leadership across the city region area in thinking that we are stronger when we stand together, and that's part of the remit of the local infrastructure organisations, is to provide that support at the local level, because obviously the combined authority is really 10 local authorities acting as one. So we describe sometimes a 10+1 in Greater Manchester. And I guess the point there is that, you know, the combined authority in itself doesn't have significant powers. It has really good leverage, and it has good soft influence and some convening powers, and it certainly has big political power, particularly because of the mayor we have in Greater Manchester. But it is the local authorities that hold significant power of decision making, and certainly will be in relation to the new NHS reforms. That's again driving that decision making into local authority area footprints. So having that connection with our sector in each of the 10 local authority areas, plus working as one in Greater Manchester, has proved to be increasingly important. So that's the role that 10GEM plays, is about connecting the local infrastructure up to and working together in a GM space. There's also then an established alternative provider collaborative, and that's, again, when we're thinking about the way the leadership group works, and there's a section of that around providers. Well, there are multiple different scales of providers that work across Greater Manchester, and some significant influence when those providers work together. It was set up initially in relation to NHS reforms and kind of influencing the health devolution opportunities, but actually it's also there really in relation to some of the other strategic ambitions of Greater Manchester. So there's an alternative provider collaborative that is led by an independent chair and supported by many other partners as well. I mentioned a little bit about the equalities networks, and I think those are, you know, they are absolutely key, and they have a significant influencing role in really driving this shared ambition around tackling inequality across Greater Manchester. We could never do enough of this. There still isn't enough, and so we're kind of looking at how do we really strengthen the intersectional and also the kind of influencing capacity and capability of these really important networks and coalitions. So GM Equal is the kind of the footprint for that across Greater Manchester, and I think it's really timely that we support really and enable that as kind of really to grow and harness its role. And then, as I mentioned before, there's other specialist and influencing networks. So there's multiple leaders that are engaging in a mental health leaders network group, and there's multiple that are in relation to tackling homelessness. We could say the same about multiple different areas of specialism activity. And, you know, that is a joy that there are so many people working at really important topics, but actually there's also that we need to kind of constantly think about, well, how do we join the dots? How do we kind of connect things across, as well as making sure people have opportunities to influence and affect change? Because we're constantly thinking about things that go up and influence it into partnerships, but also we've got to think as well about how do we affect change and take action. So again, back to Martin's point about, you know, taking solutions, but then we need to be able to implement those solutions, and, you know, driving the implementation of solutions across the multiple different networks and at different spatial levels is something that we need to constantly be mindful of and keep working at. I will speed up a bit. I think pace has slowed a bit there. These are some of the different ways.
Liz,
I've got 8 minutes. All right. Well, we're up tons of time. So these are some of the different ways in which the voluntary sector organises itself, and you know, there is a facilitative function in VSNW that really supports and underpins many of these. Not all of them, but many of these. And I do think there is real strength of knowledge and expertise in each and every one of these. There is a connection then through to the leadership group, and there is a connection through to each of the into each of the localities and to the various different thematic ways that leaders connect across the city region. But it always looks like a complex picture to the outside world. So we always look quite complicated to engage with. So providing single routes through and easy to describe routes through can be a bit challenging. And that's sometimes something that we hear a lot in terms of, well, you know, how do we have a conversation with the voluntary community-based social enterprise sector in Greater Manchester? You know, and I think it is a complex web behind the scenes, and, you know, in some ways we try and simplify that. But I do think it's an ongoing challenge, really. So I think that's something that might be worth us exploring together as a bit of a key issue. Can we move on again, please? So again, Warren, you correct me, but since I think 2015, there has been grant funding that underpins some of the ways of working of the leadership group and the Accord. So it's described as an Accord grant. And that is essentially acknowledging that it costs money to resource the capability of this leadership to be part of the partnerships and decision making, but also to be able to build its capability and capacity. So there has been that formal grant and that has been an enabling pot to the ways of working across Greater Manchester. As always, it's complex because in no way is that money ever enough, and it doesn't pay for all of the things that I've just described before, but it is about us working as smartly as we can to resource the infrastructure activities that happen at that Greater Manchester level, not necessarily the infrastructure organisations, but in some cases it's the same people providing the functions, and in others it's not. So I think it's an acknowledged cost into the system for the combined authority of having the partnership and us being able to connect the bits of the bond sector together to be part of the combined authority structures and ways of working. At various points, we have developed policy papers, we have developed influencing papers and strategies, and there's also a manifesto that's live at the moment. It's often, well, it is always not party political, but it's often used at different political interventions to ensure that, what the sector wants to kind of really push for and drive for in terms of its shared ambition is really clear to whomever the incumbent sort of either portfolio leads for the VONT sector are that come in and often do change in the Greater Manchester Combined Authority system, or if there's new changes to the chief exec level at local authorities or at the Combined Authority, or if there's significant political change as well. So that manifesto is a useful document that we come back to. And I suppose, there's probably a plethora, and I can't do justice to the sheer amounts of things that we have been involved in and tried to influence. But one of the big ones, I suppose, is the recent Great Manchester Strategy, which is a key strategic document that underpins multiple kind of other strategic and policy frames of the city region. And the VONT sector is really clearly identified within that, and the contribution and commitment that are in the Accord are mirrored in this GMS. So I think that's really important. And there's been some practical tools like the Fair Funding Protocol, and this goes on the call, who worked really hard with other colleagues on to really try and ensure that it's not just words, that some of the words and commitments in the Accord and our pledges are then affected. And so what we've got here is some specific principles into the commissioning arrangements and particularly funding expectations of the sector at a city region level. It's challenging to see how that then translates into each local authority level, because this is a combined authority funding protocol, but it does establish some good practice and frameworks that certainly you can use at a city region level and at combined authority level, but it's also useful to point to in the local authority context as well. The VONT sector is funded in various different ways, so there's all of those different policy areas there. I suppose there's significant programmes of activity that are either underway or have been in relation to these sort of areas, and I think that's why having a multiple skill set and range of leaders across the combined authority footprint is really helpful, because obviously no one organisation or individuals could feasibly do this at the same time. So it is about that coalition of the will, and again really thinking about, well, how do we make sure that people are well positioned to really affect change where they're best placed to, but that they work as systems leaders and, you know, outside of the organisational form for their organisation. And so that's been really, you know, it's good to see that list, and, you know, hopefully we keep on expanding and developing and deepening each of the ways in which the sector is funded and for what in relation to those areas. And I mentioned briefly Live Well, but there's all sorts of joint proposals and bids that we put in on alongside, and, you know, sometimes lead. So there's a strategic bid with a lottery going in at the moment, and that again is at a city region level, and not something we would have had the opportunity to do a few years ago. So I think, again, us looking at what is our leadership capability alongside the combined authority and partners, but also independently of. And what can we lever in? What can we bring to the table that others perhaps can't? That we, like, you know, which gives us a degree of influence in spaces as well. These are, I think, when surveyed, these are some of the things that are certainly within our city region came back as some of the positives, and then also some of the challenges that still exist. You know, it's by no means just the rosy picture across our city region. There is massive opportunities to work together, and I suppose, you know, again, in the context of Greater Manchester, it's always been a place that is really ambitious. It really wants to strive, often to be the first, often to be the best, but it is striving for that. So it's usually, there is fertile ground for new innovation and change, and I think that's really important. So things like the integrated settlement, its new devolution deals, its opportunity to really showcase, well, what does a prevention demonstrator mean, and how can the sector be involved in that? There are lots of firsts that come up, which can be exhausting, but also really exciting. And I think, you know, we sometimes as a sector have to make sure that we can gear up quickly enough, that we can get the right people and, you know, with the right skill sets and into those spaces. But it's definitely a space for opportunity and for us to explore our ways of working together even more. I feel like there is already, we have established senior relationships. There's a lot of work done behind the scenes by various different people and leaders, again, to maintain those relationships, because essentially people move around the city region quite a lot, and so people that may have started with a good relationship in a local authority area context with the voluntary sector, that can translate really positively up to the city region level. But of course, the opposite can also be true. So with that, people that move around, I think, you know, we across the board, I think, have really strong relationships with senior execs and political leaders as well. As I say, we've got fairly strong roots into the formal structures. It's not always where the work's done, though, as Martin rightly said. So we've also got work that happens outside of that, quite detailed work in terms of the activity, so that we're in some of the layered discussions as well, that lead to some of those formal announcements and decisions. I think where we struggle sometimes is that the combined authority, albeit established, like any local authority sort of structure, if you're familiar with those, is that there's often kind of, you know, it's got its unique context for the way that it works, so often quite siloed policy areas and directorates. So you could be having a really meaningful, you know, senior exec commitment and conversation, and, you know, agree principles at executive partnership level, but that is really difficult to then translate into some of the work, and often you have to start again at a commissioning level, and sometimes it's not as transparent then. So you can have really big senior commitment, and then it kind of, you know, when it gets into the implementation or operationalizing that policy or that program, you can then end up in a kind of a micro, kind of quite a linear commissioning conversation, rather than a kind of a system change, system partners one. We haven't tackled the issue around social value. Many people have been working at that tirelessly, but it is a struggle to constantly be thinking around, you know, aligning good growth and the opportunities around growth and Greater Manchester's potential with actually the social value that we miss, which could be much more inherent, and also just the recognition of our sector. You know, we still have to fill out all of the ridiculous things, and the TOMs and other measurement tools just really do do sort of work against some of the policy commitments that we make in Greater Manchester. Defining the voluntary community-based sector, social enterprise sector is always a challenge, and I think certainly when you're then looking at how, if we could become more data-led, how do we ensure that we can really ensure, you know, if we're measuring our success of how well have we done at ensuring that the sector is, you know, better resourced, for example, then you get into that definition of, well, who is the voluntary sector, who defines who is and isn't out of it. So for those that know Greater Manchester, so the growth company is an absolutely massive vehicle, and technically they can be described as a voluntary community-based and social enterprise sector. So again, if they're included in the framework of who's getting money, then, you know, we look like we're quids in, but it's not necessarily the case. So it definitely doesn't translate into kind of the micro and small, which make up a significant amount of our sector across Greater Manchester. And then the issue about, when I was describing before, you know, both its strength and its weakness is the 10+1 model in Greater Manchester. So it's about where are decisions taken, who actually has the capability of making the decision. And I think it's taken us a long time, and we're increasingly getting smarter at trying to understand at the outset of a policy space, and particularly when we then get into programme and implementation, is whose decision is it? So where is the money coming from? What's the funding flows? How do we understand the restrictions and the limitations of that funding flow? What is the role of the combined authority here? What is the role of usually the local authorities or whoever the accountable body is? And how do we work really smartly together at our different spatial levels to try and influence that as much as we can? So things like, for example, Pride in Place, you know, that's a massive opportunity for our sector. We absolutely need to be working at a local authority level in order to try and ensure that, and then even at that, you're looking at the neighbourhood and the kind of that neighbourhood and political councillor level as well, to ensure that we can ensure that the voluntary sector has a part in that. That's really different to, say, for example, violence reduction, which is, you know, again, the combined authority and has a much bigger influence in where that funding for violence reduction goes. And it has some leverage over how that is then trickled down and how that plays out into the local authority, into the neighbourhood spaces. So it's working out the financial flows as well as the influence and decision-making flows as well. I think I'll pause there and see if anybody has got any questions. I'd be happy to share where we've got to.
Lovely. Thank you, Liz. If people want to stick their hand up and ask a question of Martin, Liz or Laura or anybody else, please do so. I'll ask you to do it out loud if you're happy to do that. Must be some questions, surely. Carolyn Otley, would you introduce yourself and then ask a question and who you want to answer?
Yeah, so I'm Carolyn, I'm Chief Exec at Cumbria CVS, and it's quite a narrow question really, but I was really intrigued by the mention of the Alternative Provider Collaborative and quite who was part of that. I've kind of got an idea in my mind, but I wanted to just check it was what I was thinking. And I think that's Liz, isn't it?
Yeah, can do. We might be able to put a link to it in the chat if anybody can do that more quickly than I can. But so I suppose it's the larger voluntary sector providers in Greater Manchester. So at its outset, Aisha too might be on the call actually, and I think you might connect and work with the APC actually. So if you want to jump in, feel free. But essentially, it's the larger providers initially. So it was voluntary sector providers who worked across more than one local authority footprint and had an NHS contract. So that's kind of the initial formation of that group. So local infrastructure organisations do connect to it. So I am the liaison person between local infrastructure and those providers, and we do have some other partners that are on there as well. And we work really closely with that. With the APC, it sometimes does, you know, it creates a different space of influence because there is a world of provider collaboratives. So this, you know, this part of I think they describe themselves more as social businesses though, rather than necessarily exclusively voluntary community-based and social enterprise. So there's a slight nuance in who I think they would argue that is within their makeup. So it does have some not-for-profit LLPs and other things, GP federations, etc., in there, as well as, you know, some of the big Great Manchester voluntary providers like Big Life, etc., that you might have heard of. Does that help, Caroline? I'm happy to, Carolyn, I've been happy to answer any questions outside the chat as well, as if it's helpful.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. I think I guess I was wondering whether it had even smaller providers than that in, but that might be a particularly Cumbrian issue because we tend to have much smaller, much more local organisations. But yeah, I will Google it and search and have a find.
Within the local authority areas, so each of the local infrastructure organisations, many of those do have an equivalent of a partnership provider sort of leadership group. So there are multiple ways in which people who might describe themselves as providers might come together, but this is the GM version of that. So they are the larger ones in the main.
That makes sense. Thanks.
Thank you. I can't see any of the questions. I was just I've just messaged you, Kerry, if you wanted to ask that question, because I think that's a very pertinent question and is changing the nature of the relationship between the combined authority in Greater Manchester and the NHS. Shall I ask it for you, unless you don't want
Yeah,
to?
please. Sorry, I've got teenagers playing music, so I didn't want there to be that background noise. Thank you,
I'll do it
Warren.
for you then. Right. How is the NHS neighbourhood model opening up the opportunity for the sector, or do you anticipate it could restrict the VCFSE community? Shall I start with you, Liz? I don't know if this has been part of the conversations that you've had, Martin, in terms of the crossover between NHS and combined authority thinking. This is very much the live well model in Greater Manchester, and everything that does and states that it does and potentially doesn't include as part of it.
I am struggling a bit to kind of maybe a better sense of what's underneath this question might be quite useful to make sure I'm on the right track here. But I'm not, my view is I don't think the NHS neighbourhood model does open up the opportunity in itself. I think you would have had to have had the opportunity and other levers to really be making the most of that at this moment in time, because within, you know, I guess one of the challenges is having the resource at a neighbourhood level to really create meaningful partnerships and change, and that has been an ongoing issue. And some days my cat's now getting involved, to be able to kind of do that. I suppose within Greater Manchester there are other levers that we are trying to also pull at the same time as the NHS neighbourhood sort of model. So I think the commitment to 30 to 50,000 neighbourhoods is really strong, not always coterminous local authority, police, etc., and the NHS still. So I think we've still got a little bit of that across Greater Manchester. But politically, what's being driven, and I think certainly the executives across the combined authority and the Greater Manchester partnerships, which includes the NHS, is that, you know, we need to be thinking about people, we need to be thinking about the reform of public service, and we need to be thinking about prevention in its broadest sense, and that includes probably primary and secondary prevention. And we need to be thinking that at the spatial level that we think makes most sense to people. So there are all these hooks, and there's definitely kind of traction there. I think the challenge is actually seeing the shift of resources in order to affect the change. And there's not much of the recent policy initiatives through the NHS reforms that really give our sector more of that. And I think we are quite lucky in that, again, we've had all this established ways of working, we had health devolution, and without that, I think I'm not quite, you know, I think it would be a struggle at this moment in time in isolation to be seeing the NHS reforms as an opportunity to our sector. But, you know, other people on the call might think differently to that.
Thank you, Liz. I think Martin's trying to drop Mark Davis into it. Don't know if you want to come back on this question, Mark.
Yeah, I hope Mark wouldn't mind me. I think he's going to have a better perspective from me. I think, as I sort of say, the NEC at ICB Nexus is very, I think, developing. And I think some of the neighbourhood stuff is playing out within and through the ICB and the NHS more widely. Is Mark there?
I am. Sorry, I missed the
Sorry,
beginning
Mark.
of the question. That's okay. Just briefly tell me the question and I'll see what I can say.
Okay. If you get to it, where is it?
How is
It's,
the NHS
yeah.
neighbourhood model opening up the opportunity for the sector, or do you anticipate that it could restrict the VCFSE community?
Sure. Okay. So hi everyone, Mark Davis. I lead Middlesbrough Voluntary Development Agency and Enhance Raker in Cleveland. So aspects of local infrastructure provision across 2 local authority areas. And in terms of neighbourhood health in our area, we've got that those 2 areas make up the South Tees. So we've got a South Tees health and care system to some extent. In terms of that, I think when the opportunity for neighbourhood health became a thing a good few months ago, early last summer maybe, there was some real opportunities that we felt as a sector would be presented. We weren't selected to be one of the areas in the Pathfinder, or the Pathfinders, but what we had agreed was that we would, as a system, continue to develop our thinking around that, and we very much see primary care as the kind of front and centre to some extent. That's the local systems view. I think where we're at, it's still a work in progress. It's more of the same of 1 step forward, 2 steps back would be my view. But I think the opportunities, just like what Liz was saying, in terms of the aspirations of neighbourhoods, 30 to 50,000 people, all those kinds of things, there's a great opportunity in terms of aligning around that. But that also comes with a challenge for many organisations working across 2, 3, 4, 5 or 6 of those neighbourhood areas. That can be a challenge. So I'm very much in the optimistic, hopeful space around that still, but I am concerned that I could be being naive around this, and is it just going to be another thing where we're on a journey and then at some point it'll come crashing to a halt and then we can't move forward. I'm not sure I've really answered any question in a helpful way, but other than to add some thoughts and say it's a work in progress.
Yeah, I think it was really intuitive to hear from Liz, Mark and Martin. Thank you very much for giving insight into that. I think my fear is that potentially the faith aspects of the voluntary community faith social enterprise model will be kind of sidelined because the NHS has quite I don't know how to word it, but they have quite like where faith elements don't really appear in the NHS model. So I think that's an initial fear that I have, and that the NHS neighbourhood model, that they might actually govern in different organisations to support the neighbourhood in its entirety. So that potentially that would mean that the voluntary community faith social enterprise model won't be able to have the greatest impact as it once has. I know that we've got the neighbourhood model in St Helens being piloted at the minute, so it'd be interesting about that. But I must say it is a concern that I have, but I just wanted to just expand on the reason for my questioning.
Thank you very much, Kerry. Is there any other questions from anybody else? Otherwise, we'll go to workshops and just start talking about what your priority areas or strategic priorities might be, what you want to do through relationships with combined authorities, what support you might need, and how you would want to work or network across the Northwest. Got one more question from Peter.
Yeah, I think I posted it in the chat, Warren. Just
sorry. Yeah.
I noticed, Liz, that you said that in GM the combined authority agreement was funded 50-50 by the combined authority and the NHS, and I just wondered is that unusual? Because my experience, and forgive me if I've got this wrong, Johanna, but sitting on the VCFSE Alliance seems to be very much bilateral discussions, let's say with the ICB, and I don't feel that sort of joined upness of health and the local authority. So I just wondered whether what you were describing was unusual for GM.
I think it might be fairly unusual in that, again, it's about our ways of working predate some of the investment, and then I guess instruction to ICBs, etc., to form alliances or have alliances, etc. So I think, yeah, its history has probably helped it to kind of to grow that, but also this issue about coterminosity across the city region. So there's, I guess there's so they have sort of, there's still very distinct ways of working in separation, difference between NHS, GM and the combined authority, but increasingly there's less distance between them. And so at an accord level, there is absolutely a joint commitment of funding resourcing, but that commitment has to play out in two different institutional spaces as a minimum if we were affecting any of the commitment, making inroads into any of the commitments. So to that extent, it's not different. But in terms of the joint political and I guess senior executive commitment, it's quite aligned.
Thank you, Liz. No other questions. We'll go to breakout rooms. So what do you want to prioritise? How do you see it working together, and what support might you need? So if you could think through in each group the kind of main messages that come back for the feedback session and nominate somebody, that would be useful. We've not. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you had time to talk through and you weren't getting bored there. So it's useful. So we're just going to kind of go round and see if we can get somebody from each group just to share feedback and then think through what next steps might look like, if any are useful to you. Is there any nominated people who would like to feedback on the session, the workshop room? So the three questions were, and don't worry if you haven't covered all of these, what are your priority areas? What would you like to know more about? And how do you want to network across the North, if that's useful questions? Is there anybody from a group who would put for Alison?
I'll take one for the team here.
Thank you.
So we talked a lot about language, how we get our sector to be talking in the language of a combined authority, and how we reframe the work that we do so it fits within their thinking. So they talk about circular economies, community wealth building and all that social economy. So we have to start getting our members of our CVS in York and North Yorkshire to be talking in that way and to start thinking in a very different way. So forget health now. Who knows what's coming from there? Is there any money? Probably not. It's all of the combined authority, but how do we start to make our case in their language? And how do we fit what we do within their framework? So how does what we do within health, for example, fit their economic, their growth plans, etc.? So we've got a real task to do, to look at what do we do to sort of fit into them. Unfortunately, again, that's what we have to do. So we talked a bit about that. We're all on the same page about how we do that. So any top tips or anything that anybody can produce to stop us all doing our own thing would be really helpful. We are seeing not being described, and I've heard it this week from the Combined Authority, as fluffy. What we do is really fluffy and it's not really economic and it's not about skills development. So, again, how do we make that case? And I think we do know how to do it. I think it's the capacity that it's going to take for all of us to really get to grips with this agenda on top of everything else. And I think just talking about the third question, neighbourhoods, networks. So we're all keen to sort of keep in touch with each other, feeling there's more strength if we're all learning from each other, sharing good practice, any documents, any training, any successes would be great. So we can do that by meeting again like this, or by sharing stuff on some virtual platform would be good. Recording meetings would be good so people can pick it up at any time. So I will stop there.
Thank you. That was really useful. Thank you very much. Garth, you've been nominated. And as a VSW trustee, I don't think you're allowed to say no.
Okay, thanks, Warren. We had a big discussion around sort of lobbying and influencing and getting through backdoor ways into national thinking. So we thought there might be some scope there. There was some scepticism in the group as well, but I think working together across the North, we can probably get a voice in, whether that's with all our Northern MPs and maybe talking of setting up a Northern MPs group that we can communicate with, as well as national government. So that was one area we talked about. We similarly shared about showing good practice and networking. We thought there's definitely value in that, of learning from those areas that are more developed and more on the journey was there. What else did we discuss? Practical problem solving, I suppose, about how we can come together to try and come together and share some practical problem solvings and almost build layers of the onion. I think John Hannon suggested of like the coalition of the willing across the north. So it might be, is there stuff people that want to do community transport together, which is one of the questions from earlier, or any of the core competencies of combined authorities. We could probably set up more niche groups with the willing that could develop things around business support or employment and skills or any topic really. So maybe some practical solutions, which the presentations were saying we need to come with the answers, not just ask for money. So maybe collectively across the north we can come up with some of those solutions. I think that's what I tapped up from it. Have I missed anything out, Joe, or any of the other members of the group? But we thought it was a good idea.
You've got the shake of no gaps there from Joe, so that's good. And any other Kerry?
Hi.
I don't think you got into a group, did you? But
no, but I was able to share. So my name's Kerry Moore, and my area that I'd like to prioritise is those who are care experienced or experienced trauma. What I've identified is that those who are care experienced, the statistics are quite prevalent of those that either their own children enter the care system or the youth justice system or end up homeless. So the cost implications of not providing a support, I suppose. There's been some quite media heightened cases around supported accommodation, where some deaths by suicide, where there was a neurodivergent need alongside being a care leaver. So there's increasing momentum being built in terms of policies. So a lot of local authorities have voluntarily adapted the protected characteristics of care experienced. So that would mean that the Equality Act would need to be diversified, and a lot of local authority policies would need to be edified if that was to pass through Parliament. At the moment, it sits within the House of Lords. But I'm really passionate about lived experience supporting from a lived experience peer support for those who are care experienced, but also I'm a parent carer, I'm neurodivergent, and I've struggled with my mental health. So I've got a lot of kind of areas where I've experienced low social economic outcomes. So I'm passionate about bringing change, passionate about speaking, passionate about bringing positive change for those who have faced, sadly, the most horrendous beginning to their journey. So yeah, if that resonates, I suppose the difficulty I found and just to is kind of getting up off the ground in terms of policies and governance. There's kind of a lot of policies that you need to have in place, but there doesn't seem to be like a kind of catalogue of kind of policies that we can use as a template and adapt. And yeah, I'm just open. I love meeting people. I love hearing journeys. I love networking. So if that resonates with you, please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, Kerry Moore. I'll put it in the chat. But yeah, great.
Put it in the chat, Kerry.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there any other groups who've not had a chance for their views, feedback to feed in? But did we just have 2 workshops in the end? Anybody else? Is that you, Gary?
Yeah, I can feed in from room 5, but I'm going to throw my colleague under the bus as well and say we didn't answer any of the questions that you set us. Just had a nice conversation. So I think what we did talk about though was probably more practical examples or practical ongoing situations, I suppose, in terms of VCC organisations. How do they engage with commissioners moving forwards, whether that be ICB or combined authority, and obviously the landscape is changing in all areas of our. So if you've built up contacts over the last 2-3 years, they're all obviously changing, and what will become, we don't know. I think we had the conversation as well around whether or not it's easier, harder, or just different if you are a condition-specific VCSE organisation, and therefore you've got natural links into, let's say, health to support people with various conditions, or whether you're kind of the more generic supportive VCSE community-based organisation doing lots of things for everybody, but then obviously doesn't have a direct link to any individual from a commissioning point of view. So we had a very broad conversation around the challenges that lie ahead for organisations. But unfortunately, in terms of solutions, I think it's a watch this space as the landscape unfurls.
Yeah, thank you, Gary. I know we very early on somebody referenced the civil society covenant at the beginning of the meeting, and the two conversations that DCMS are looking at now as part of the implementation of that are, one, what does local implementation look like, and the other was around commissioning. So there might be a good connection there, and I think they're interested, the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, in terms of how the relationship with combined authorities is playing out. So I think we could make that connection. I think, Liz, you had your hand up.
I'm just in the chat encouraging some of my fabulous colleagues that were on that, so people don't have to hear from me again. So chip in anyone that might want to.
I'm happy to go if you want, Liz. That's fine.
Go on, Ryan. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I think we spoke around in terms of networking. I think it'd be useful to learn from how we engage with the combined authorities. I think every place is different, we were saying, so you can't necessarily translate what's happening in one place to the other, but certainly how we engage with the combined authority and learning from other areas would be really useful. I think back to Martin's point during his presentation as well, we were talking about having kind of like entry points at different levels of the combined authority as well, not just having a seat on the board, but actually having lots of different entry points into the combined authority if needed, is very important as well. And then I think Caroline was talking a little bit around how there are different levels of devolution. So actually, you know, in terms of Greater Manchester's probably off the scale in terms of what's going on there compared to other areas. But yeah, it's in terms of kind of how you can effectively engage with a combined authority based on their level of devolution, and probably not losing sight on the unitary authorities as well, responsibilities moving forward. I've probably forgotten something there, my group, sorry, but if there's anything else, chip in.
Anybody else from Ryan and Liz's group? Sounds good though. I think that's key. I don't want to kind of commit to anything at this point. It does sound like we need some way of being able to share stuff, some way to be able to network, perhaps on a continuing basis at this level. But it feels like we probably need to be getting into things whereby we're at least looking and sharing conversations around specific issues. So I could see transport, skills, economic and activity have become like the beginning points of what a combined authority looks like. I do think the commissioning conversation is really important. I think we do need to make the case for capacity as a part of the conversation with combined authorities. I know some they're up for it, and then others it's just something they would never even consider. So there's a very much a two-tone approach to thinking through how they work with us. We'll pull together, affordable housing, absolutely. It's a huge part of kind of the beginnings of what a CA wants to be about. Absolutely. So we'll include that. So we'll see what we could offer. But if anybody else wants to offer anything in terms of creating something, I was trying to avoid becoming something that underpins all this. So I'm very much up for more of a collaborative approach to how we support each other rather than you all waiting for somebody else to do something, if that makes sense. Joe, do you want to come in?
It's just a reflection. You will not be surprised to hear that I was one of the skeptics that Garth referred to. I became persuaded through the course of the call that I think it is actually a good idea. I suppose the thing that has made me hesitate the most is my experience of trying to connect up all of the voluntary sector alliances across England and how frustrating it is when you have evidence of something working in an area where authorities engage and get it, and you cannot gain traction in your area because they simply don't or won't. And I think that it's better, I think, if people are coming together for the sheer love of it rather than because they're paid to do it or something like that. Do you see what I just think as soon as there's money on the table, it confuses and complexifies things that just don't need to be that way. I think if we can share what the problems are and what the potential solutions are in a flexible way that doesn't actually make people feel bad about it, then that's really good.
I totally agree. There isn't any money for this either, so that should make it align with what you've just said. Caroline.
I was just going to offer out anything we can do to support it, Warren. I think in our session, I was kind of flagging that please don't forget about your transport operators. They aren't often engaged in your VCFS structures or alliances or anything like that. But your combined authority will 100% have a transport responsibility. So we've got a social value toolkit which is aimed at transport, and kind of we've got quite a number of operators that are completing that. So we should have by March anyway some nice social value stats of the impact of accessible transport. So again, we can share that across, depending on how many operators have completed it, we might be able to do it regionally, but we can definitely do it for across the north. You know, I've got team members that we can kind of put time in to support places. I know, Joe, I need to do a follow-up with you. We met just before Christmas, and we're doing work kind of over in Northeast as well. So yeah, it's just that offer of kind of engagement, and we've got some good examples of where things have worked and haven't worked in other places. But you're quite right, it depends what your local assets are as to whether things will or won't work that somewhere else has done.
I think that's a fantastic offer, Caroline. We'll snap your hand up if you're happy for that to happen. Lovely. It might be a nice way to think through how we create ways of networking around specific themes and see if that's a useful model. But if we start with that one and try and grow it rather than say, let's have 4 or 5 or 6 or 7, let's just start there and see how it works. That's useful. Anything else from anybody? Otherwise, we'll wrap up. I'm sure we're all late for the next meeting. But thank you very much, and thank you particularly to Liz, Martin, and Laura, and Yobi for making the event today. And thank you very much, everybody who's come along. We'll share the recording. We'll share the notes from the final session as well in terms of next steps. Lovely. Thank you, everybody.